Let's return now to the notion of the original position. The idea, just by way of review, that Rawls has here is that the original position is supposed to be a kind of hypothetical frame of mind. It's a certain perspective that any of us could take at any time. You just have to think in accordance with these guidelines or strictures. So it's not an actual historical period or anything like that. It's a frame of mind that we might enter into at any time. And Rawls' idea is that it's supposed to be a kind of fair frame of mind, an unbiased frame of mind. And so it's the proper frame of mind to be in when we're considering questions, fundamental questions about justice, fundamental questions about the basic structure of society. How should we structure our major social institutions? What would justice require of them? How should we distribute the goods of social cooperation, such as wealth and rights and so on, right? The original position is the frame of mind. It's Rawls's description of the frame of mind that we should be in when we're thinking about and answering those kinds of questions about justice. Okay. Now, we talked about the first three strictures, first three items on that list in a previous video. And in a previous video, I said we talk about the fourth one, this idea that in the original position, we're supposed to be behind the veil of ignorance, that we'd talk about that later. Well, now is later. Now is the time that we're going to talk about it. So what exactly is this veil of ignorance? Before we jump into the details, let me just emphasize something I said earlier. The veil of ignorance is what renders the original position fair. This is really, in certain ways, it's not the only feature of the original position, but it's in certain ways the most important feature of the original position, this veil of ignorance. It's what makes the original position a fair position. And so it's what renders agreements in the original position fair. So let's look at what exactly it is. And I think Rawls gives a very good example for how we can start building up what exactly he's looking at here, what exactly is supposed to be included in this veil of ignorance. So he says something like this. Imagine, people in society today. And imagine the question before them is how we should structure the tax code. Who should be taxed and how much and so on, right? Those kinds of questions come up all the time. It's a kind of constant political debate over these kinds of things where it comes and goes, but it's fairly regular, yeah? So people today are going to weigh in certain ways. And what Rawls asks us to consider is, well, first, imagine someone with lots of money. Imagine someone, one of these 1%ers or whatever, who just got all the money, tons and tons of money, one of these rich people. Well, not every one of them, but a lot of them, or a significant chunk maybe, I don't know, some of them at the very least, when it comes to matters of taxation and how much certain people or groups of people should be taxed, they're going to advocate for policies that would tax them less. And so a rich person, a very wealthy person, a 1%er, might advocate for something like a flat tax. A flat tax is a tax that taxes everybody at the same rate. So if you make $10,000, you're taxed at, say, 20%. If you make $1 billion, you're taxed at 20%. Everybody's taxed at the same rate. That's not what we have in the United States. It's what we have in Illinois, although that's up for, that's on the ballot this election. The United States income tax is not flat. It's progressive, which means people who make more money pay at a higher rate. People who make less money pay at a lower rate. And so people who make more money pay much more in taxes. People who make less money pay much less in taxes. So you might have a very rich person advocate for a flat tax. A flat tax would lower the rate of taxation on rich people, presumably, right? The particular kind of flat tax this guy would probably be advocating would lower their rate of taxation a lot, say from like 35% to 20%, right? So they'd be saving a lot of money if something like a flat tax were to pass. What would Rawls say about this? He'd say, look, these rich people advocating for something like a flat tax or lowering the tax rate on capital gains or whatever, right? Things like this. There are other ways that rich, wealthier people might benefit themselves through modifying the tax code. They only want to do that. This guy's only advocating for the flat tax because he knows that it's going to benefit him, right? He's biased in his own favor. He knows that he's going to be benefited by something like a flat tax, and that's why he's advocating for it. But that's not fair. You're advocating for some general policy just out of your own particular interest because you know it'll benefit you. That's not fair. You're biased, right? You're biased in favor of this policy because you know your particular circumstances. You know you're one of the wealthy people who will benefit from it. Unfair. And that might seem, oh, yeah, of course, that seems obvious. I don't know. We hear that kind of thing all the time. Rich people are just looking out for rich people and whatever, trying to mess with everybody else just to make themselves richer and so on. Okay, fine. But Rawls actually kind of flips the table, right? So he tells a story like that. Like, yeah, rich people advocating for lower taxes on the richest people. That's not fair. They're being biased. But he says you can also consider it from the other end. Right, so people in the lower socioeconomic classes, in the lower tax brackets, right, who make under minimum wage or just that minimum wage or whatever, right? People in the lowest quintile of earners, they might advocate for a policy that would tax them less, right? They might advocate for a stronger progressive tax, where we tax the rich at an even higher rate than we currently do, and we tax the poorer at an even lower rate than we currently do, right? So an even stronger progressive tax in that sense. So shifting even more of the tax burden onto the top earners and shifting even less of it away from the lower earners, right? A poorer person might advocate for something like that. Rawls would say the same exact thing about such a proposal coming from such a person. It looks like, at least as far as it goes, you're advocating that because it's going to benefit you. You stand to gain by that. You know that you're in this lower quintile or whatever. You're in this lower socioeconomic class. And so you're advocating now for a policy that will benefit you in particular. You are biased in your own favor. That's unfair, right? Rawls would say the same exact thing here. So rich people, yeah, they're being unfair and biased in their own favor by advocating for certain kinds of tax policies, but poorer people might do the same exact thing, advocate for certain policies that favor them. In both cases, people are being biased and unfair. If we want to make fair decisions, unbiased, fair decisions about what justice requires and how our major social institutions should be arranged, and the tax structure is going to be part of this, these major social institutions. If we want to make unbiased, fair decisions about these matters, well, what these examples reveal is that we need to kind of be ignorant or pretend like we don't know about how much money we have. That's the idea behind the veil of ignorance. And so one of the things that we're going to be ignorant of when we're behind the veil of ignorance is our social or economic status. Our economic status biases us. It makes us favor our own economic class. And so when we enter this hypothetical frame of mind that is the original position, we need to step behind a veil of ignorance. And what that means is we need to pretend like we don't know how much money we have. We need to pretend like we're ignorant of how much money we have. We don't know if we're in the 1%. We don't know if we're in the 99%. We don't know if we're in the lower quintile, the middle quintile, or whatever. We don't know anything about our particular economic status. Only that way will our decisions about what kind of tax policy we should have be fair, right? Otherwise, people are just going to be vying for their own interests. Yeah, they're going to be biased in their own favor. And so we have to be ignorant of those things. Using the same idea, we can start fleshing out everything else that Rawls talks about as being included in this veil of ignorance. So you're going to be people behind the veil of ignorance are ignorant of their economic status. They're also ignorant of their social status. And he doesn't spell this out in detail and doesn't use these words or concepts in detail or categories. But I take it that what he would likely mean, or if he didn't, Rawlsian today most certainly would mean, that's going to include things like race, like gender, and social sexual orientation. Because look, certain policies could favor one race, gender, or sexual orientation over another. And people of the race, gender, or sexual orientation that stand to be benefited by the policy, they might advocate it because it benefits them. Yeah. Whereas your decisions, your policy preferences, and so on, would be rendered fair and unbiased if you were ignorant, if you didn't know what your race or gender was, right? So somebody might favor, put it this way, somebody, a white person might favor certain kinds of policies that benefit white people in particular, because they know that they're white, because they know that they stand to be benefited by those policies. Well, that's not fair, according to Rawls. You're being biased in your own favor. And if you're of a different race, you probably wouldn't advocate that policy. And so when we're making these decisions about the basic structure of society, about what justice requires, the most fundamental levels, we need to kind of be ignorant of what our race is. Otherwise, we are liable to be biased in our own favor. Right? That's Rawls's idea. And then, so similar stories you could tell about gender and sexual orientation, right? Somebody might favor policies. If you know what your gender is, you might favor policies that are beneficial to your particular gender. Right? Well, that's bias. That's unfair. You're being unfair to people of other, people that aren't your gender. We're looking for the true, legitimate, fair principles of justice. By being aware of these particular facts about yourself, you're kind of blocking your access to what fairness might require. You're not being impartial. Right? The veil of ignorance is supposed to render the original position an impartial, unbiased frame of mind. When we are aware of our race, gender, social, sexual orientation, and our economic status, we're partial to those things. We are liable to favor policies that favor us, right? Favor our race, gender, sexual orientation, or economic status. And so we got to pretend like we don't know any of that stuff. Rawls continues. There are other things, other sources of bias. Your natural talents or skills, right? So, I don't know. Example. I obviously acquired a PhD in philosophy. If I were a biased kind of fella, I might say, you know what? I think we should advocate for a policy that awards all humanities PhDs $1 million. Take it out of the paychecks of all those engineers and scientists and business people, whatever, right? They got enough money. Us humanities folk, we could use a little bit more money. So I want a policy like that. Well, okay, that's absurd, but also, it's the only reason I would advocate for something like that, if I were to, is because I know what benefits me. people of my particular with my particular skills or abilities, right? And so I might advocate policies that favor me in particular. Well, that's not fair, right? If advocating for policies that favor one particular set of talents over another just because they're yours is you're being biased. You're biased in your own favor. And so we need to remove this potential source of bias, right? Race, gender, sexual orientation, economic status, the skills, abilities, talents that you have. These are all potential sources of bias that could skew our decisions. Yeah, something like that. So we need to be ignorant of our natural talents or abilities. We need to be ignorant, Rawls claims, and this is perhaps one of the most controversial parts of the veil of ignorance. We need to be ignorant of our conception of the good, what we take to be worthwhile and good in life, of ultimate value. We need to be ignorant of that. And so that's going to include things like kind of worked out ethical views. It's going to include things like your religion, if you are a religion, or if you're not a religion, right? It's going to include what exactly you think is worthwhile in life, what the point of life is, what the meaning of life is, right? All of this, we've got to pretend like we're ignorant of, because if you allow that in, it's a source of bias, right? People of one particular religion might favor policies that are in line with that religion, or perhaps even that encourage that religion, or make the practice of other religions more difficult, while easing the practice of one's own religion. These kind of comprehensive views of value, right, ethical views or religious views or whatever they might be, are potential sources of bias, right? And so decisions made could be rendered unfair if the people making the decisions knew these things about themselves, right? And so people in the original position are going to be, behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, are going to be ignorant of their own conception of the good. They know, if you now recall, I believe it was the first feature of the original position, people in the original position are concerned to further their own interests. What we're now seeing with this idea that you're going to be ignorant of your conception of the good, of what's good in life, what a good life looks like, what's of value. What Rawls is saying is that people in the original position, yeah, they're going to be concerned to further their own interests, but they're not going to have any idea what their own interests are because they're ignorant of their conception of the good. And so people in the original position, they know that they're going to have interests. They know that they're going to want to further them, but they don't know what they are. They don't know what it is that they're wanting to further, right? It's a kind of bizarre situation. It's a strange frame of mind, but this is the only way to make a rational and fair decision, according to Rawls. Continuing on, he says we're going to be people in the original position behind the veil of ignorance are going to be ignorant of their own particular psychological propensities. This is far less important than some of the other things that we've been seeing. He includes this to help him later on when he's talking about why people would accept his two principles of justice in the original position, because his argument for it, as we're going to see, involves kind of a certain level of risk aversion. This doesn't matter so much, right? You don't know if you're particularly risk averse or if you're very daring. That's all he's saying here, because that could be a source of bias. Not that important for our purposes. You don't know which generation you belong to. You don't know if you're old or young. This is another category that Rawls mentions. And you think about it for 2 seconds. Like, yeah, okay, that makes sense too. Obviously, policies could favor the old and disfavor the young. They could favor the young and disfavor the old, and so on. Right? This is an obvious thing that's kind of come to the fore between millennials and boomers or whatever, and they're always fighting or whatever, right? Stuff like that, right? If you know your generation, you're going to be biased in your own generation's favor. That's unfair. That renders your decisions unfair, your policy proposals unfair. So you need to pretend like you don't know which generation you belong. That's the veil of ignorance. Oh, last thing he mentions, you're going to be ignorant of your society's particular circumstances. This is going to be important for some of what he talks about later on too. So the psychological propensities and your ignorance of your society's own particular circumstances are going to kind of come back. A lot of this stuff actually is going to come back when he turns to arguing why people in the original position would accept his two principles. But psychological propensities and the particularities of one society are kind of noteworthy because they seem like a little bit of odd inclusions on this list. The other ones you can kind of make sense of. You can tell these stories about, right? Boomers favoring themselves over millennials, or men favoring themselves over women, or something like that. But psychological propensities in the particular circumstances of your society seem a little bit odd in comparison to those. And so I'm just flagging that for you now, because the reason he's including that here is because it's going to be important later. But don't worry too much about it. But what he's saying here is that you're not going to know if your society, the society that we're, so when you're in the original position, you are thinking about what principles of justice you're going to be used to structure society. What that means, in effect, is you're going to be thinking about what the major social institution should look like. Are we going to have a constitutional democracy? Are we going to have a monarchy? Are we going to have a dictatorship? Are we going to have competitive markets? Are we going to have a command economy? Are we going to have monopolies? Are we going to have right? Private property, no private property, and so on. What he's saying here is that when you're making decisions like that, when you're trying to figure out what the major social institution should look like, what the basic structure of society should be, you should be ignorant of the economic and political circumstances of that society. You don't know what level of wealth the society has. If it's very wealthy, if it's a first world country, or if it's very poor. You don't know. You've got to render yourself ignorant of those things because that's a potential source of bias. And likewise, you don't know the level of culture or technology, how culturally advanced or technologically advanced your society is, the society that you'll enter into when you step out from behind the veil of ignorance, because those are sources of bias, according to Rawls. Okay. So, as you might imagine, the veil of ignorance is mostly concerned with what you're ignorant of, and it's right. So you have to pretend like you don't know all of this stuff. Only then are your decisions going to be fair, because every potential source of bias will have been removed. But Rawls goes on and describes what people in the original position behind the veil of ignorance will in fact know. Right. So there are certain things that he wants to say people in the original position will have knowledge of. And so this is also in certain ways kind of part of the veil of ignorance. So you step behind this veil of ignorance, and what it does for the most part is eliminate all this particular knowledge of your particular self and your particular circumstances. But what it also gives you is a certain kind of knowledge of general facts. And as you're going to see in just a second, basically what it makes us, what the veil of ignorance does when we step behind the veil of ignorance, what we're supposed to imagine is that we kind of become expert social scientists. So we don't know anything about our own particularities or society, but we know everything about societies in general. Something like that is Rawls' idea. And so behind the veil of ignorance, one will know general facts about human society. That human beings live in society, how they tend to function, how they tend to work, what leads to their dissolution, things like that. Behind the veil of ignorance, people are going to know in general how political affairs work, how political processes work or don't work, as the case may be, how politics happens. People behind so in some sense, right, you might think of this as being, people behind the veil of ignorance are going to know general facts about human societies and how they work and run. They're going to be something like, sociologists, expert sociologists, or perhaps even anthropologists. They're going to know how political affairs work, how voting works, how incentives work in the political sphere. They're going to be expert political scientists, right? They're going to be expert sociologists, expert political scientists. They're going to be expert economists. They're going to know how economics works. They're going to know the basis of social organization. So maybe that's more the sociology one, anthropology, sociology. They're going to know how human beings are motivated, how human beings' psychology tends to work, right? They're going to know the laws of human psychology, right? So they're expert anthropologists, expert political scientists, expert economists, expert sociologists, and expert psychologists. But their expertise is all at the level of generality. They don't know anything particular about themselves, but they know how human beings in general work. And Rawls closes by saying, and really any other general fact that may affect the choice of principles of justice, we can assume that they know. And his idea here is, well, look, economics and sociology and political science and so on, they're all getting at the truth of things. And some of this knowledge about how human societies work and how voting works and how economics works and so on, that stuff might be relevant to the choice of principles. And so we should allow it in. It's not, these things aren't sources of bias, right? Economics is not going to buy. It's just, economics when done properly just gives you the kind of objective truth about how economic matters work. That's not a source of bias. That's a source of truth. And so we should allow them to have that knowledge just in case it's helpful or useful as they make their decisions. And any general fact, so no particular facts, but any general fact, that might affect the choice of principles, so long as it doesn't bias them or it's not a source of partiality, we can assume that they have. So if it made any difference, it won't. But if it did, we could say, yeah, they know physics and chemistry and everything else and math and everything, right? It's not going to really matter according to Rawls if they know that or not. But he'd be happy to grant it to them, right? That's the idea, so long as those things didn't bias people. And Rawls seems to think that the real sources of potential bias are going to be particularities about yourself. And so the veil of ignorance, it's fundamentally a way of rendering ourselves unbiased and impartial by removing knowledge of one's own particularities.